Good evening. Welcome to the Henry George School for this 5-session course on assessing land values, principles and method. Our lecturer for this class that we will be having for 5 consecutive Mondays is Ted Gwartney, a world-class authority in assessments. Ted is an outstanding Georgia scholar, and his credentials and achievements are simply too many to be listed here today. But please allow me to mention a few of them. So Ted is a former professor at Baruch College. He was the assessor of Greenwich, Connecticut, until he retired in 2012. Before that, he held similar positions in Sacramento County between 1969 and 1970, Southfield, Michigan, 1966 and 1969. He was also the chief executive officer of the British Columbia Assessment Authority in Canada from 1975 to 1986. So Ted has authored many publications, many of which are available online. You may just do a quick Google search if you are interested. And we have the pleasure of welcoming him today at the Henry George School for this series of lectures that I myself was really looking forward to. So I hope you all enjoy it. Ted, the floor is yours. You may start now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I've started by showing the content of the 5 lectures to give you some idea. Tonight, we're going to be talking about the nature of land, fundamentals of assessment, and the role of the assessor. And then a week from now, we're going to be talking about good government and statewide differences in property taxes. And the 3rd session on August 16th, we're going to talk about Henry George's theories and actually show a revaluation that was done in Greenwich, Connecticut. Then the 4th session, August 23rd, we're going to be talking about land rental capture using the various formulas for estimating rent and showing kind of all the difficult parts of doing it. And then the 5th, the last one, will be recent efforts for obtaining land revenue and some examples. So that's basically the plan that we have for the sessions. And I've just showed my background here. In particular, I highlighted my jobs as assessors so that you can just be aware of them. So tonight's session is understanding land, fundamentals of assessment, and the role of the assessor. These are sponsored, of course, by the Henry George School, and I've been a supporter of the social philosophy and economic reforms that Henry George has advocated. And in particular, association and equality is the law of human progress, and to abolish all taxation save upon land values. And that is what got me into the assessment field. The importance of land rent. Land is a primary source of public revenue, and collecting land rent could reduce taxes on wages, buildings, workers, producers, merchants, and enhance the wealth of all people. Why collect land rent? Well, land rent is created by the community, and land rent belongs to the community. And land rent is adequate to fund all public purposes. As lessons go on, I'm going to be building upon these kind of fundamental things I'm saying tonight, and you'll see how they work out and how they work through. So, talk now about the nature of land. Land in an economic sense is defined as the entire material universe outside of people and their products. It includes all rights to natural resources, materials, airwaves, as well as the ground. This chart kind of shows the various rights that a person has on their land area. Primary, of course, is the house and the use of the land. In this particular case, this property has a stream going through it, so there are riparian rights. There's timber rights and agricultural rights. And beneath the land are the mineral rights, of course, and the groundwater rights, which are important here in California. And above them are the air rights. So those are the basic natures of land. Now, factors of land value. There's 4 factors that would kind of help us get a better feel for land and where its value comes from. First factor is physical attributes of the land, including the quality of its location, the soil fertility, the climate, the convenience to shopping, schools and parks, the availability of water, sewers, utilities, and public transportation. The second one is legal and governmental forces, which include the type and amount of taxation, zoning, building laws, etc. The third factor are the social factors, which include population growth, changes in family size, typical ages, the prestige, and educational features. And the fourth one is the economic forces, which include income levels, growth in new construction, vacancy, and availability of land. Now, land is unique. Land is fixed in supply, land is immobile, and land is indispensable. First, it's fixed in supply, and it's immobile. It cannot be moved. It cannot be manufactured, cannot be reproduced. And land is required directly or indirectly in the production of all goods and services. All people at all times must make use of land. So land is indispensable, fixed in supply, immobile, and indispensable. Land rent is the price paid annually for the exclusive right to use a certain location, a piece of land or other natural resource. Equity and efficiency require that the general public, the community that created land value, should be paid for the exclusive right to use a land site. Land has no production cost. It's nature's gift, which enables life to continue and to prosper. And landowners do not increase its value. There's no incentive function. Land and capital are variable in supply, so they have an incentive function. A higher price paid for commodities and buildings causes more labor and capital to make itself available. But land is fixed in supply. You can't build more. Rent serves no such incentive function. Rent is a surplus. Economic rent is the only source of public revenue that has no negative effect on the productive potential of the economy. Okay. Economically, rent is a surplus. When a community captures land rent for public purposes, both efficiency and equity are realized. Public revenue. Public revenue should not be supplied by taxes, such as income or wage taxes, sales, commodity, or value-added taxes, until all of the available revenue has been first collected from the nature and community-created rental value of land. So often I'll talk about how taxes are unnecessary because the rental value of land is sufficient to provide the revenue needs that communities require. Land speculation. The tax on land is a means of limiting speculation in land prices. This would keep the land from being held out of use, ensuring that all citizens have equal opportunity to be productive. People could invest in productive equipment and wages rather than high land prices, which produce no additional tangible wealth. This really hit me when I was young in college. I was a real estate major. And of course, my whole objective was to make a fortune selling and dealing in real estate. But by taking the Henry George School class, I really found out, what the fundamentals are about land. And this is what drove me into the assessing profession when I was a youngster. Why land has value. The limited supply and natural productivity of soil and natural resources. That's number one. Number two is the publicly provided services and improvements that increase the market value of land. And number three is the growth of communities and people's competitive demand for the exclusive use of prime sites. So basically, the three reasons that land has value are its limited supply, the natural productivity, what nature gave us, what the public then has added on in providing services and improvements, and then the growth of our communities that create the demand for land. These are the three primary factors that give and enhance land value as time goes on. Land location. Assessors appraisers always talk about the value of land is based upon three things: location, location, location. The price that people and businesses are willing to pay for the exclusive right to possess and use a better land site for a period of time. Use sites of better location because it gives them an advantage, such as spending less time in travel, near amenities, selling more goods or merchandise. We'll go on as we go on through this. There's really hundreds of factors that come into giving land better location advantages and that increase and enhance the value of land. And through these 5 lectures, we'll learn a lot of these factors. Community values. The full community along with nature creates land value and secures its exclusive use. That is, it polices its exclusive use. The community adds to the market value by making improvements. And the collection of land rent for public revenue returns this value to the community. So I started off talking about how the community creates the land values and the land values belong to the community. And this is kind of emphasizing that point. Landholders bonus. When a major part of land rent is not collected, which is the case in most of the world today, the value of the public improvements become an asset which benefit landholders, although they did nothing to create it. The longer the land possessors hold the land out of use, the greater will be the bonus they obtain. Landowners actually make money by not using the land, but by keeping it out of use. And this is what creates land value, because people then are forced to use inferior locations. Urban sprawl. Land possessors can force the premature use of less desirable land. It raises the cost of community improvements and the rental value of unused but better located land. If you have to go over unused land in order to extend a road, you're benefiting that unused land, but the cost gets higher to the community because of the extra amount of road that you have to put in. Using city land inefficiently creates huge unnecessary pressures on the natural environment and increases infrastructure and transportation costs. The prosperous city Cities that collect much of the full rental value of land are more compact and provide better, less costly amenities for their citizens. As the city becomes more prosperous and its population grows, its land becomes more valuable. I learned this on my first assessing job in Southfield, Michigan. I was 26 years of age at the time, but it gave me the chance to actually see that by capturing more of the full rental value of land, not all of it, but more than had been collected in the past, we were able to see that the city became prosperous. Businesses and people wanted to locate in Southfield because of its economic base and because the city was a prosperous place to live and to do business. Profit while sleeping. When people can make a larger profit by doing nothing, but keeping the land that they possess out of use for a long period of time, they will do so. When the community collects the market rent of land, they eliminate the motive for keeping land out of effective use. So in essence, what I learned when I was young is that raising more revenue from the land or taxing land was an incentive for people to use their land or to sell to someone who would use it, instead of holding it for the longer period of time and making a profit while sleeping. Land rent represents more than 25% of gross domestic product. There are few communities that have collected enough of their land rent to effectively curb land speculation and create a prosperous city. Most cities in the world collect less than 1% of the value of the economic value of land, which is not enough to really generate what is needed for a prosperous city. Studies have demonstrated that communities prosper and succeed in proportion to the percentage of land rent that they collect. Whatever is not collected will be capitalized into land value, and the cost of land at inflated market prices is a block to new business. To maintain an equitable society where nobody has special benefits that they do not pay for is as important for the community to collect all of the land rent. That would be the ideal. This map kind of shows the amount of land rent that is collected by counties and in the various states of the United States. This was in the period 2007 to 11. And the amount of land rent collected in the United States is typically less than 1%, but there are some cities and some counties that get up to 2%. Certainly in Connecticut, there was a few cities that were collecting 3% of land rent. The more that was collected, the better off the city was. One city was Greenwich, Connecticut, where I was the assessor, which didn't collect 3%, but they collected enough that it made it a prosperous city. So this kind of shows you where your location is compared to others. California, of course, has Proposition 13, which has limited the amount of assessments. And you can see that in some places there's very little collected, whereas in other places like New York State, New Jersey, and New England, the amount collected is much greater. We're going to go into the second part, but I thought I would just allow questions at this point. What we talked about is the nature of land and land value. And the second part, I'm going to be talking about the property tax and the role of the assessor. But if you have any questions about the nature of land, what I've talked about so far, I'd be happy to discuss them with you. And Abraham, if there's any questions in the, are there any questions in the question box?
I'm gonna open up for
Okay.
if anyone has a question for just about 2-3 minutes. I see Let's see who is raising the hands there. Yanis.
Yeah.
Yanis, go ahead. Make it brief, please.
Yes. Hi, Ted. Thank you for the presentation so far. I have a very simple question. What's the definition of community? Is there a geographical definition? How far does it go? Does it go on the county level, on the city level, on the state level, or a combination of the above? Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Kind of rephrase that. My hearing is not that great. And rephrase your question in just a very clear way.
Yes. What's the definition of community?
Community. Okay.
Okay. Is there a geographic limit? Is it by block? Is it by county? Is it by city? By state? Like what's the quantitative definition of community? Thank you.
Okay. The definition of community is that group of properties that fall under the same kind of assessment system. And usually most communities are of the city. But there are some counties that assess all the properties within the county. And there's a few states that actually assess all the properties within the state. So the community kind of depends upon the type of jurisdiction there is. And then within a community, there are neighborhoods. And the neighborhoods kind of define the different values of those neighborhoods. But I've used the term community to talk about the collection of land rent and the use of land rent, which is usually like a city or county type basis. Is there another question?
Thank you.
I believe Lars is trying to ask a question. Lars, go ahead. Okay.
Well, who is being called on?
I was calling Lars, but it doesn't seem that he's ready. So Bill, you may go ahead.
Well, I'll ask a question.
Go ahead.
Ted, frequently we say that the value of a parcel is has nothing to do with what you do, but rather due to what your neighbors do. And that's because land rent is a flow rather than a stock. And perhaps you could explain a little bit more about that.
Okay, what you said is basically a truism. The community or the neighborhood that you're in develops values really based upon the attitudes of those people within the community. And those values pretty much are consistent within a community. For example, when we value land in a neighborhood, we find out that the property values are fairly similar. And we make adjustments for differences of size or differences of amenities. But for the most part, the value is not based upon what the individual homeowner did. It's what the community did for that homeowner. And the value is a community created land value. And so basically what the property owner does, is not really affecting the land as value as what the community has done that has enhanced the land value. Okay, I'm going to go on to the second part then. The second part is the property tax and the role of the assessor.
Ted, if you don't mind, there's more question. There's just one last question.
Go ahead.
Lars, go ahead. You are unmuted. You can just speak, okay? He's not responding. Let's go ahead, Ted.
All right, shall I go ahead?
Yeah.
Okay, the second part of my talk is going to be talking about the property tax and the role of the assessor. And then we'll take questions about everything at the end. So the property tax, you get a bill each year that gives you your property tax. And that is based upon, one, the market value of the property, two, an equalization assessment ratio. That ratio is usually set by either the county or the state to equalize taxes. For example, you may be in a jurisdiction that has 3 or 4 different school districts in it, or a school district that covers several jurisdictions, and you want to equalize it so that everyone is basically paying for the schools based upon an equalized assessment. So as county assessors or state assessors then do an equalization factor. And then you have a tax rate. The tax rate is set by the city or by the community, and that's based upon the needs of the city and the tax revenue base. And that is what becomes then the tax obligation of the property owner. To show it just as an example, the market value of the house could be $300,000. The equalization factor might be 90%, and the tax rate may be 0.0085, less than 1%. Your tax bill would be $2,295. So that's how your tax bill is created. The property tax produces the required revenue for the municipality needs. And the tax rate is based upon the total of assessments. So what we do is we start with the revenue needed, divide it by the total of assessments, and that gives us our tax rate. So in this example, the revenue needed was $300 million. The total of assessments was $35 billion. So the tax rate is 0.00857. Now, what's unique about the property tax is that it's different than a sales and income tax, because when an economy goes down, sales taxes and income taxes vary with the economy, and they tend to go down. Property taxes, on the other hand, are based upon each year what the community needs divided by the tax base. So it would not decline in the way that a sales or income tax would decline. There's overlapping jurisdictions, and that's why you have equalization factors. You have counties, you have cities, you have school districts, utility districts, and other special taxing authorities. What is fair market value? It's the price that a willing and informed seller would sell the property to a willing and informed buyer, neither being under any compulsion to act. This is the definition that's used in the appraisal profession. And it basically says that fair market value, it has to involve informed people, both buyers and sellers, without a compulsion to act. So looking at sales, you have to consider, was that sale truly a market value sale with an informed seller buyer, not under any compulsion to act? If it was a foreclosure sale, for example, that's a compulsion to act, and that's not a valid sale that you could say is representative of what the market value might be in that community. Property tax bills are sent to the property owners, and they contain the times and terms of the bill. If the owner fails to pay the tax, the property can be seized and sold, and taxes constitute a lien on the property. So transfers are also subject to the tax. So you can go bankrupt, it doesn't affect the property tax, it's still there. And there's a lot of places, where the property gets reverted back to the city, but the city eventually gets to sell it, and eventually it gets its revenue. Property tax liens are often sold by a jurisdiction, and the buyer then, by paying for that paying off that lien, will get the title to the property. So the property taxes basically are a tax that continue on. You can't just sell the property and run away from it, because the buyer will have a lien on that property and he'll have to pay what you did not pay. The administration of the property tax. Local governments levy it, usually city and counties, but each state has its own laws with different rules and procedures, but uniform methods are required. And they impose limits on local jurisdictions. At the second session, we're going to be actually looking at the differences in laws and rules for each of the states and provinces. And you'll be able to kind of do comparisons of see how your state compares with other states in terms of the rules and procedures that are used. So we'll be covering that in the second lesson. Okay, the next part that I'm going to be talking about is the role of the assessor. The role of the assessor is to estimate value of property expressed as an assessment. Fundamentals of assessment, and the assessor's job is to tell the public what, why, and when. The scope of the work that they're going to be doing, the methods, the analysis and sales study, the models that they've developed and applied, the tax results and shifts that are going to occur, and the rights to appeal to correct the assessments. There's 3 valuation methods that are used both in appraising and in assessing. The first is the market approach to value. The second is the cost approach to value. And the third is the income approach to value. The market approach to value uses recent market sales in similar location and characteristics. We generally use sales within a neighborhood to determine what the values are. And land is generally the most important part of the value of a property. We then make adjustments for differences based upon what the market sales have told us. The cost approach is the second approach. And in that approach, you first determine the land value. Second, estimate the replacement cost. And then third, subtract depreciation for deterioration and obsolescence. Many jurisdictions use a kind of market-oriented cost approach because they have new constructions and so forth, and they're able to do this. But depreciation in an older community is very difficult to estimate, and they must really go back more to a market-oriented basis. And then on commercial property, the income approach is used. And on the income approach, the market value is equal to the net income of a property divided by its capitalization rate. And we're going to spend a lot of time talking about this in the future, but just basically is that value equals income divided by rate for commercial property. And there are methods used to value real estate. And the 4 that I'm going to be mentioning are first, developing a database. Second, studying the comparable sales. Third, developing valuation models. And then finally, applying the valuation models. And in our third lesson, we're going to be actually doing a revaluation in which we'll demonstrate the details of how we go through these processes. Speaking first of land value, neighborhoods or locations in a town are the primary features of land value. We tend to group properties in a neighborhood in order to find common values that are typical of the land within that area. The size of a lot and the special features that it have are very important. The views and the street outlook that a property has are very important. And then its location, desirable or undesirable, next to highways or railroads, ponds, ocean, parks, open space, and anything else that has either a positive or negative influence on value. So we find that the land value basically, when we're going down to the details, we have to consider each site on its own merits. You know, like to commercial property, being adjacent to a highway is pretty important, but to a residential property, you'd rather be adjacent to a park or a pond or open space. Okay.
Questions?
Okay.
You're going too fast.
All right, the assessors all use parcel maps. And when you go into an assessor's office, they have a book that shows all the maps. Oftentimes the assessors develop these maps themselves, or they use maps that were created by the planning department. And then in valuing a particular property, like this red one, for example, they're able to compare it with the other properties and see its size, its location, and some of its attributes. So very important in terms of valuation are the using of the parcel maps in valuing land. Then neighborhoods are very important. In this jurisdiction, we found that there were 60 neighborhoods that had properties, houses or properties, both commercial and residential, that were common or had common characteristics within that neighborhood. Some of those common characteristics could be the size of land. For example, was it in terms of acres or square feet, for example? And the kinds of styles and uses, were they fancy homes or were they more working class homes? And the conforming market values within a neighborhood. So here you have 60 neighborhoods in this community, and you kind of look for characteristics then that are common, that kind of set value trends within that area. And then you look for the differences from one property to other to make the adjustments. This next map is a map of land values. This is the same community, but showing land values. And you can see that to the north, the light green are the lowest valued. And as you go south down to the bottom, it's those bright colors that are on the ocean that are the most valuable. And there's one spot that's quite reddish that is kind of like the commercial area of this town. And then you see areas along the ocean that tend to have higher values than those inland. And you see that there is a variance based upon how far you're located, from the civic center and from the ocean to the backlands. The least valuable lands are those that are yellow. Those are usually large acreages that are either publicly owned, or they're parks, or they're large acreages held for future subdivision. And those have the least value. The ones with the greater value then are the green ones, the light green, and then it goes to the darker greens as you get closer to the city and closer to the amenities.
Excuse me, I
Yes.
can't see the screen. It's not,
That's a problem at your end. We are all seeing it.
Yeah, change it to a full screen on your computer. You'll be able to see it then. So that's basically showing the land value maps are extremely important, and assessors get into detail so that they can go property by property. And some assessors actually publish the value per square foot for each lot going down the street, and showing adjustments for differences on the lots based upon certain amenities that one site will have compared to another site. So then in valuing land, we also consider the sales. And in valuing land, there are vacant sales, there are tear down sales that have old buildings on them that are going to be torn down. So it's really a piece of land that's being bought. But the cost of tearing down the building has to be subtracted because has to be added on to the tear down value, because that's what the people are really paying for that piece. And then we have land residual sales, and land residual sales are every improved sale that happens, you're able to remove the building value, and what's left is the land value. So you have more sales of land than you have of improved properties, because you have not only all the improved sales, but you have all the vacant and tear down sales. And that's why land is so much easier to value, because you have such good information on land. So now we've valued the land. Now we're going to go to the home assessment and talk about that. Here's some of the characteristics of homes that, that the assessors look at. Size is extremely important, and the characteristics of the home. And then the type of home and the style of the home. Some areas, the colonials get a much higher price than ranches, for example. The number of bathrooms and bedrooms are very important. The special features, such as fireplaces, the condition and the age of the house, any additions or remodeling that have gone on. And then there's the outbuildings, the garages, the swimming pools, the other things that enhance the building values of the parcel. So you then develop valuation models, and the sales predict the importance that purchasers place on the property features. And the land is based upon its location, size, allowable uses, and the building's based largely upon size, quality, condition, and features. When people are out looking at properties, these are kind of the basic things they have in mind. The location of the land, its size and how it can be used. And for the buildings, its size, its quality, its condition, its features. Now, commercial property is different. On commercial property, again, you're looking at its size and the condition and the additions and so forth and the locations. But you also have income and expense data, which makes commercial properties a little bit different in terms of valuation. So commercial properties are valued by the sales approach, the cost approach, and the income approach. And on the income approach, the net income is divided by a capitalization rate to determine its value. Net income is the gross income minus the average vacancy minus the typical expenses. So when an assessor is looking at doing an income approach, he's looking at what has typically happened in terms of gross income for the commercial properties, what the average vacancy is, and what the typical expenses are. This gives them a net income, and he uses the capitalization rate. In our next sessions, we're going to be giving great detail about how we develop capitalization rates and how we use them in estimating value based upon how we treat net income. And those will be in our upcoming lectures that we have. So then the next thing is a visit to the assessor's office. After the assessor has applied his valuation models, he's applied them to all the properties, both residential and commercial. They then test the results against new sales. That's the way of proving how good of a job you've done. You've got the sales that were all past history that you use to develop your values, but then you want to look at all the new sales that occur after you've completed the value and see, do the models equal or come very close to that price that the new sales indicate. And that's what proves how good your assessment is. So based upon that, the assessor then sends out the notices of new assessments. And the property owner wants to make sure that the data is correct. They ask the assessor's office to correct any errors. And they bring in things that are different. Oftentimes the assessor is making some assumptions based upon common things that are found in homes. And then they find that there's something that is different in this home that needs to be corrected. So you ask the appraiser to explain how the valuation was done, what the formulas were. And if you're unhappy, you schedule a hearing with the Board of Assessment Appeals. Now, revaluation is where you deal with all of the property within a jurisdiction at the same time. And the goal of a revaluation is to update all real property to the same valuation date, to correct all errors, to discover any changes, and to ensure that there's fairness and equity in assessment. Assessors sometimes are unaware of changes that people make in their property, and this is a way of looking for any corrections that need to be made. And to be sure that they equalize all the assessments to a standard level, and that standard level is market value. On a revaluation, you want to revalue all property, all residential, all the commercial. And it says cities have revenue needs. This is going to be the last slide. How we calculate the tax rate. We kind of did it earlier, but I'm going to go over it again. Determine the tax rate by dividing the revenue needed by the total assessment base. So the revenue needed is $300 million. The total assessment is $35 billion. You need to make the division. Your tax rate is 0.00857 or $8.57 per $1,000 of value. And that's how the tax rate is determined. So that's basically the end of my presentation. And I now invite you to raise questions about it, and I'll be try to answer them.
Great. The floor is open for questions. You may be able to unmute yourselves now. Any questions, comment? Yes, Lars, go ahead.
You have to unmute yourself in order for me to hear what your question is.
I don't know. I saw him raise his hand. His mic is unmuted, but he's not asking the question.
Well, while you're thinking of questions, I'm going to give you an example of questions that are typical that I get as an assessor. In this one, the question was, my home is the same as my neighbor's, but why is it assessed for a higher amount? Well, my answer would be there's something different that makes your house more valuable. And we have to then sit down with the property owner and show them why it's different. It could be that the two houses were built at the same time by the same builder, but there's something different about the one that's appraised and assessed at a higher price. And so we answer his question by going into detail of comparing his assessment with his neighbors that both have the same house, looking for what the difference is. Another question that I typically got was, why is my neighbor's assessment not that much higher than mine, but their lot is much bigger? Sales indicate that people will pay extra for excess land, but at a lesser rate per foot. So what we're saying there is that if you have a bigger lot, you're willing to pay more for it, but at a lower rate, because the extra amount you cannot build another house on. It gives you more yard, it gives you more utility, but it's not going to be as valuable as that main lot that gives you the ability to build a house on it. That's the primary thing that you want, is to build a house, and the extra land you'll pay for, but you'll pay for at a lower rate because of it's not as valuable as the lot that you're going to be building on. And then a third question is, why must my town change or revalue property so often? For fairness and equity among property owners and different property types. In essence, towns do revaluations in order to bring fairness to all people. And sometimes you find out that, for example, commercial properties have been paying less than residential, or they've been paying more than residential. Or you find out that some neighborhoods have been paying higher amounts because at one time they were considered to be the best neighborhood, but something's happened and the things have changed. So there are changes that go on in real estate as time goes on. The whole purpose of doing a revaluation is to ensure fairness and equity among property owners. and among the different property types. So that's why we do reassessments. And then another question that I got asked often was, why is my lakefront lot assessed higher? Well, it's because sales indicate that people want to have land on the lake. And a lakefront lot sells for a higher price than a lot that's maybe got only a lake view or no, or is distant to a lake. So in essence, those are typical questions. I'd invite you now to ask any additional questions that you might have, and asking them, be sure that I see 2 hands are up.
Ed Dotson.
Ed Dotson is 1 and Scott Baker.
Yeah, go ahead, Ed.
Oh, hey, Ted, what's always been curious to me is, to what extent do assessors have access to the detailed appraisal reports that are performed by appraisers in connection with mortgage financing?
They typically do not have access to them at all. They would like to have access, but they have not been given that access. They of course do have access to all the sales that occur. And they do have access to a lot of information about the properties, but generally speaking, the mortgage grantors are not required by law to transfer information to the assessor about what the mortgage amount or valuation that was made by the appraiser is. Sometimes appraisers will bring in appraisals that were done for mortgage companies in order to dispute an assessment or to raise questions about assessment. But the assessors don't have the right to demand that information, although they would like to get it.
Will they pay for it?
Generally, no. They have enough information to do their job. They'd like to get it, but I don't think that they would be willing to pay for it. No.
Great.
Thanks.
Scott Baker.
Hello, Ted. So my question is, from the first part of the lecture, if the goal is to use the single tax on land to pay for everything and then get rid of all the other taxes, how does that work with when you have to figure out the tax rate based on the total amount that the municipality needs divided by the value of the property, which seems to be a fairly rigid formula, because that wouldn't give you enough revenue in that case to do what you're saying, to basically tax the full rental value and then be able to replace all the other taxes with that.
Well, as we go along, we're going to be learning how to do this, and we're going to be answering that question, in particular on the 3rd and 4th lecture series. But in essence, what I'm suggesting is that we base the tax upon the rental value of land. So we really don't need to know what the market value of land is, because we can look at what the rental value is. And of course, you cannot collect more than 100% of the rental value. So you're going to have to maybe raise taxes from taxation sources such as sales or income. But I'm suggesting that you not do that until you've collected most or all of the rental value of land. Then only once you've collected all the rental value of land, then it would be appropriate, if it's needed, to raise taxes from other sources, income and sales. It's my view that I think I'm going to be able to demonstrate that land rental is adequate to take care of all community needs. And that I'm going to try to explain and show that in the last few lectures that we give on this series.
Thank you, Yanis. And next would be Warren.
Yeah, thank you, Ted. I have one specific question about the revaluations. And I'm asking because you were in Greenwich, Connecticut, which is coastal. And the past 10, 15 years, there's been this climate scare about sea level rise. And I'm wondering, have you revalued coastal properties in Greenwich down because of the fear of them being flooded in the coming decades, or they still go up?
Market price.
Can can you I have a hard time understanding the point of your question.
Yes.
Few words.
Do factors like climate change and expected sea level rise has it led to valuing down coastal properties, for example, in Greenwich, where you were an assessor, or you didn't see that happening?
Can someone just ask that question briefly for me so I can answer it?
Climate change, Ted. Climate change and sea level rise. Does that factor into your property valuation, especially for coastal front properties?
I think he's asking if the valuation for the properties in Greenwich, Connecticut, for example, considered climate change, sea level rise, etc. impacts.
Okay, thank you. Yes, of course, they have to do that. If there's any diminishment of value due to the climate or due to changes that occur, they have to be reflected. And in fact, when we went on the third lesson, I'm going to be showing you what we did in Connecticut, in Greenwich, Connecticut, because of the recession that we had in 2008. We had to actually go in and reduce a lot of property values because of that change in value that was caused by the great diminishment in value in the year 2008. So assessors have to keep on top of changes. And certainly if there is changes in, the sea level, where you're losing land, or other things where your land is not as valuable, they have to be reflected. And of course, this is also true if something is added that enhances the value, it has to be reflected. So the assessor looks with fresh eyes each year at a property and considers what the advantages and disadvantages that he sees are at that point and reflects it based upon the market values and what people are willing to pay, either extra or less because of the change that's occurred.
Has that happened in Greenwich? Have values gone down because of sea level rise?
Because of human rights?
Sea level rise.
Sea level rise.
Sea level?
Sea level.
Obviously, if you're losing land that cannot be used because of sea level, you'd have to lower the value. Yes.
Has that happened? I'm not saying theoretically. Has that happened?
He has a special session that will talk about Greenwich. So, but I think what he said is clear. The market price is what drives the assessment. If the sea level is rising and people want to still pay more for it, of course it's going to be revalued. But if the prices go down, the valuation will go down. The market drives the prices. So let's go with Mark.
Hi there. I'm not sure if I maybe missed something, but earlier you were just talking about how it's important to look at the rental value and not the market value. And I guess I don't really understand exactly why these, certainly in the long term, wouldn't be equivalent. The market sale value being the capitalized value of all future rental streams expected, including imputed rents. So could you expound on that a bit?
Yeah, you want to consider both the market value and the rental value. I didn't mean to imply that you don't look at the rental value. You look at market value and rental value are directly related through a capitalization process. So you're able to understand what rental value is based upon market value, and you're able to understand what market value is based upon rental value. So the two are directly related, and the two are basically telling you the same story. The value that people are willing to pay, be it rental value or market value for a particular site. So I think to answer your question is that they're both basically looked at.
Great. I believe Warren must be trying to raise his hand. Warren?
Yes.
Go
Yeah.
ahead.
Okay. I am in a downtown commercial area. There are a lot of vacant units. I also know that the rents are very high on those units and maybe not affordable for some business to move in there based on the market, the retail possibilities. I would like to know more about the capitalization rate in determining the value of the property based on income and whether or not our town may be undertaxing those properties. And therefore, the owner can keep those places vacant and sit on it because he's paying less taxes than the loss of revenue. And he can sit on there and keep them empty. Thank you.
Okay, I think to answer that question, in doing an income approach, which are usually done on commercial properties, you're looking at what is the typical vacancy rather than the actual vacancy. And if you were able to see that people were deliberately holding their properties vacant, you would say, well, that's beyond what is a typical vacancy. You know, they're trying to get a lower assessment by lying about the real vacancy. And the assessor wants to look at what the real typical vacancy is going to be. And if a property is being held out of, it's just like holding land out of use. If you're holding land out of use, that doesn't reduce its value. The value of the land continues on. If you're holding a commercial site out of use, it doesn't diminish the value of the site. It's looking at what would be typical. Now, it could be that the typical vacancy is going to be greater in some commercial areas just because the demand has gone down that much. So rather than being a 5% vacancy, it might be a 10% vacancy. But you're still looking at what is typical so that you don't lower an assessment based upon a person's, desire to keep it vacant for a reason.
Great. Lars, do you still want to ask your question?
If you can hear me, I think I fixed it.
We can hear you, yes.
Great, I'm so sorry. So my question is, Mr. Gwartney, you were the assessor for Southfield City. There's an enclave within Southfield, which I believe is called Lathrop, and then there's Southfield Township right on top. Were you the assessor just for Southfield City or not the other two? Because it would make a really interesting comparison to see what's happened to those other two if you weren't.
It was only for the city of Southfield, not the other two.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much for that. I don't want to hog too much of any other questions, but let someone else go. Otherwise, I'll have other more questions.
Go ahead, because there is nobody else raising their hands.
Okay. So my other question is, how do you deal with revaluations if, say, a theoretical evil land speculator insists that you downvalue their land and upvalue their property, and this happens a lot, and they try to exert pressure on you? How do you respond to that? Critics have said that this is what's going to happen and why your method isn't going to work at scale. Do you have a response to that?
Well, you're looking at, again, what the market tells you, and if you are seeing that people are deliberately holding land out of use that has a market value, that market value is going to be increasing as time goes on, and it's going to force those people to either use it properly or to sell it to someone else who will use it properly. So the market corrects those people that are trying to, grab an advantage. As long as the assessor does his job correctly, he'll get the right value on the property, and he will either get the person to develop the property or sell it to someone who will develop it. So I think that that's the way it gets corrected. It's the pressure. And we found that cities that do a good job of land valuation do see that they're, a lot of their sites that are poorly improved get re-improved, maybe with better, or get improved where they may not have been improved at all because of the pressure that the land tax brings on them.
Yanis.
Yes, as an assessor, do you have access to maintenance and upkeep costs and investments, and how far back can you go? And is that information available to the proverbial informed buyer or not?
I've always had a hard time understanding Giannis, and if someone will just summarize in a few words what he just asked.
Do you have access to maintenance and upkeep records, and does the so-called informed buyer also have access to those? I think that's what he said.
Okay. I don't. If you're talking about, I think that maintenance is visual. You know, you can see if properties are being maintained. If there's a question about, you know, getting permits to do maintenance, we certainly have access to all the information that the planning department has. The planning department is another government agency. They're willing to tell us whatever they know about either maintenance or improvements. We certainly know when buildings get added on to, we immediately find out. And we send people out to add on the building onto the assessment. And in some cases, we even prorate the taxes for the period of the year that it was built. So I think if the question was, do we have access to information? Certainly any information that is public, which would be planning information or other things that are part of the public record, we have access to and we utilize, and that we then know as a basis of affecting the values for individual properties.
Cities usually do not go around assessing whether buildings have maintenance records. That's not the purview of a city or an assessor.
Mhm.
Okay, Ed Dodson.
Hey, Ted, I have a somewhat challenging question for you with regard to zoning and variances. If you're an assessor in a community that is growing, let's say, for example, it was once a rather distant rural community, but is now at the edge of the suburbs, and there's a good deal of development coming in. So there's a lot of changing land uses. For example, along a major highway that might have been lined with residential properties. Now those residential properties, their highest best use is retail or commercial, but the zoning hasn't yet changed. But there's good evidence that the planning commission for that community grants variances very easily. How does an assessor anticipate changing land use and changing and variances to existing zoning, or does the appraiser, does the assessor?
The answer is yes. The assessor is aware of the variances that are allowed, and variances become a market factor so that people actually see that properties, like for example, along a major road that's going to be changed to commercial over time, that the market is already willing to pay added amounts for that future variance. And the assessor is allowed to say that this is a market function. Certainly in Southfield, Michigan, we have this a lot, where we had main streets that had houses on them that had commercial that adjacent that was going to be obviously developed. And I remember we had one person came in that had a house that we valued at $250,000, and they thought we were crazy, you know. But then when we pointed out what was happening in their neighborhood and what the other values of properties in their neighborhood were selling for, you know, they very quickly realized that that as much as they love their house, that eventually it's going to be bought by someone who's going to tear it down and build a commercial use on it. And they accepted it. And the courts were accepting it. The courts would say that this is a market function where the anticipation of change is so obvious, improved by sales, that you're able to make those adjustments before the zoning changes.
Just to follow up on that, then is that an acknowledgement that the real capital value of the land is the land plus demolition of the existing structure?
Yes, it's important to realize that if you buy a property that has a big building on it or a house on it or something like that, and you pay, let's say, $250,000 for the land with a house on it, but you have to demolish the house, and it's going to cost you $50,000 to tear down the house and to get the site ready, leveled, and tear out all the stuff that was there and get the site ready to use. So you have to add that cost of demolition onto the price you paid for the property to come up with what the true land value is. The land value is the sum of the price that you paid plus the cost of the demolition. And that's what a person is actually paying for the use of a site that he could build, a proper improvement on.
Thank you.
Good. James has a question. Go ahead, James.
Okay. Hey, if property taxes were to pay all the government expenses, what percentage of property value would there likely be? The map you showed 1, 2, 3, 4% of, I think, total value of the property. What percent of it would it be under 100% tax paid by land?
Okay, I'm going to tell you my views and realize that my views would vary by location and by what needs of the community are and by 100 different things. But my own personal view is that a local community, if they were to collect, I would say that typically the capitalization rate in a community is between 6 and 8%. Typically, assessors have found 6 or 7% to be pretty typical. That in order to significantly get most of the land revenue, you'd have to have a tax of maybe 4 or 5%. And jurisdictions that collect that much in terms of taxes would then, see most of the revenue then coming from land. Of course, if you have a community that's wasteful and needed more revenue, you might have to take taxes from other places. But I'm personally convinced that in most cases, a community, a city, for example, doesn't have to raise any taxes at all. They can simply collect the land rental. If the land rental is about maybe 4% of the market value of the land, that would give them enough revenue to take care of, all of the needs of the community, and maintaining. And in some cases, I think many people believe that they would get more than they would need, and that you would be forced to then give a citizen's dividend. There were some people that used to talk about citizens' dividend, where in addition to collecting the revenue and using it for all the things you needed, that you'd have more revenue than you needed. And in fairness, you'd then give everyone a check for the extra revenue that was not needed to take care of the municipal needs. We're going to be spending time kind of theorizing and thinking about this. And so to answer your question, there's no absolutes. You can't say, well, that there's going to be enough or not. There may or may not be enough from land revenue. I personally think that there is, but I'm sure that people can find other cases where there is not. And I'm sure you can find some where there's so much that you'd have to give back a citizen's dividend, or you just would have to collect less.
Good. Joe.
Hi, Ted. Great performance. Great presentation. Looking forward to what's coming. Quick question for you. If you did raise the tax to, let's say, 4 or 5%, wouldn't that have the effect of reducing the price of land? And therefore, you'd be getting 4 or 5% on less and less value each year?
No, because you're not reducing the amount of rent. A tax does not reduce the amount of rent. It reduces the amount of market value, but it does not reduce the rent. The rent continues on the same. It's just who gets the rent. Does the rent go to a land speculator, or does the land go to the community? So my argument is that the rent is going to continue the same. It's going to go up over time. So I would rather have the community collect that rent. The market value going down doesn't change the rent. It only changes what people are willing to pay extra for that building that's on it. And I see the day where people would be, willing to pay their land rent, and then the building would become kind of like an extra thing that you would pay for. Had a nice house that might be worth $200,000, but you're willing to pay a land rent of, whatever, $500 a month or whatever in addition. So to answer your question, collecting a lot of land rent will reduce the land value, but it will not reduce the rental value. The rental value stays the same.
Thanks so much for clarifying that.
Thanks. Adam. Go ahead, Adam. All right, so let's go with Tom Rossman. We'll come back to Adam later. Okay, go ahead, go ahead. Sorry.
Ted, thank you for your presentation. I had wanted to ask, you had mentioned before about the assessor who believed that property which was in use for residential had commercial value. How does whether the zoning and building code, how do changes in the zoning and building code affect assessments? I mean, if the developer doesn't ultimately get the desired building and zoning code changes, even though he believes the market value to support the use that he wants to put the land to.
Okay, the answer is in market sales. The market indicates, for example, whether there is a bonus people are willing to pay for the expectation of a change of zone. And in most cases, zoning is pretty solid. So in most cases, people are only willing to pay for the zoning as it exists because the chances of it changing are so small. But there are situations in which the chances of us changing are proven by sales. And all the sales that are occurring have built in the fact that everyone knows it's going to change. So the fact that it hasn't changed, the market is ignoring. They're saying it's going to change. So we're reflecting that because of market sales.
Thanks. Tom Rossman.
Yes, Ted, excellent presentation. Thank you very much. Couple of questions. So, in your opinion, what's the best example of a city where it's really working they're using its land well to benefit the community? And two, what do you think the biggest challenge is to implementing land value return? And then lastly, is it easier to implement this land value return policy in an existing city or a new city?
Okay, that's a bunch of questions. First of all, I'll use Greenwich, Connecticut as an example of a city that's using its land well and having good results. What you find in Greenwich is that the land value is so great because it's being used properly. In most cities, you think of land being maybe 25 or 30% of total value, but in Greenwich, the average was 65% land and only 35% improvements. So that's a way of showing that the land is being used well because the people are paying for it, and they reflect the fact that the value is worth it, and that the house is kind of like the extra that they're willing to pay, but the land is the primary thing that they're buying. And another thing was, is it better to do this in a new city or an existing city or an old city? And the point is any city. It really can be done in an old city or a new city. I mean, in a new city, it would be very obvious to be able to estimate the land rental values and everyone understand them. In an old city, again, it's easy to estimate the land rental values and to apply them, and people would get used to the changes that it brought about. In an old city, raising land rent, largely is going to be seeing changes to the city, seeing old buildings torn down and replaced with new ones, seeing old buildings maintained. In a new city, I think you're going to see, merely the progress of the new city and new development going on as there was a demand and need for properties. Were there other parts to that question?
Yeah, the other question was, what do you think the biggest challenge is to implementing land value return in general?
It's getting people convinced of land economics. You know, it's something that most people just simply don't understand, and they don't understand the importance of it. And you know, part of the problem I think we had is the fact that in economics, you know, there was the effort made to kind of confuse land with improvements, with capital, land and capital being the same, which they're not. So as a result, students are not being taught about land and the importance of land in colleges anymore. And as a result, you have a population that's very poorly educated, that doesn't really have a good understanding of the importance of land, and doesn't understand why we have these periodic 18.5-year cycles where we run into crashes. I mean, they're now becoming where we can almost predict them down to the day when we're going to have our next crash. It's going to be 2026.5. And we're able to do this because we have the evidence over history of seeing this. But yet you don't have the people that have been going through the colleges are willing to be able to make that precise of a guess because they don't understand land value. I guess to answer your question is that you need to get people to understand the importance of land, which is the difficult job we have.
We need a good narrative for that. Great questions, Tom. Lars, yes, we have about 10 more minutes, so we're going to take more from Lars and Ed Dodson.
Okay, so my next question is, how accurate, precise does your division of a site's value between land and improvements have to be for these good Georgist benefits to kick in? Like what's your margin of error for where it stops working in all the ways that are advertised? Like how precise do you have to be in your assessments for it to work? Or do you have like a wide range of wiggle room to work with?
Well, you have some wiggle, you do have a wide range of wiggle room. And certainly in terms of assessing, not all assessments are done perfectly, you know, and not all allocation between land and buildings are done perfectly. But yet the assessor attempts to do the best job possible with the knowledge he has and with the sales he has. And so the idea, I think, is to improve as time goes on the quality of the work you're doing. And in terms of assessment, that's the assessor's job. And I think good assessors see each time they do a revaluation or do major updates that they're getting better results and that they're doing a better job and it's being more accepted by the public. I really feel like it's something where you have wiggle room, but you want to do as best as possible. And the sales are what help you do that.
I have
Ed, could you raise your hand so we know that you have a question? Okay, good. Let's go with Ed and then next, Rose.
Ted, I was just thinking in the response you gave earlier about the shift from market value to rental value as the basis for revenue. The one issue you didn't say anything about was the legal authorization. I mean, if land prices are coming down because more and more rent is being collected, at some point the community, its city council, its county authorities, whatever, would they not have to pass a law that says we will now no longer use market value as our basis for our tax base? We'll now begin to shift to rental value. Is that not correct?
Yeah, actually, in California in 2010, I wrote a law which amended Proposition 13. And the new Proposition 13 started off by saying that taxation of real estate would be based upon land rental value. And that went before the state agencies that considered new legislation. And they said, yes, this is legal. This could be done in California. And you can switch from a property tax based upon value to a rental value. And that they said that the numbers we came up with the amount of the tax rate that would be needed to pay all the taxes of all people in California were accurate, and that this could go before the people and they could vote on it if they wanted to. So I can give you an example where it's actually been done someplace. Unfortunately, it didn't get passed into law, and we didn't have the money to make a strong campaign for it, but at least we were able to write the law and show how to do it and meet the state requirements so that it was a legal thing in California.
And an INR in California would do the trick.
Yes.
Great.
Mary Rose.
Hi there. I just wanted to comment that the word Georgist way is not actually an accurate terminology. Land value taxation is recognized in global sectors such as the United Nations, the Habitat Agenda that came out of the city summits in Istanbul in 1996 uses the word land value taxation as one of the many financial mechanisms. So to misname it as a Georgist way is probably not recognizing that this is not just a Georgist, how would you, ownership. This is something that is being, I think, misused. So I think if we look at it as land value taxation as a mechanism, it doesn't necessarily belong to an ideology. It may have been brought up through a group of people that followed Henry George after Henry George passed away and called themselves single taxers. And then it moved into land value Georgism. So don't get stuck on the terminology of these ideologies. I think it's best to use when we're talking about land assessments and economics to use the actual terms of land value taxation that's formally recognized. Thank you.
So you're absolutely right. In fact, as an assessor, I never would call myself a Georgist. It would confuse people and it would not get down to the point of what we want to do. So I think it is kind of foolish to maybe use the terms Georgist, or even sometimes I do things without being, without trying to identify. I think you're right with the statement you made.
Good. Dan Sullivan.
You're muted.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I agree with Mary Rose and Ted. And we have this debate among ideological Georgists all the time, which is that they seem to think that people hate taxes, and so you have to call it something else. And neither the people in government nor the average citizen who is not an ideologue expects there to be no taxes. They just want the best government for the least tax, and land value tax gives you that. And, if it's technically not a tax, that's something for the philosophers to sort through, but the philosophers are irrelevant to the political landscape. So, I'm all for calling it a tax. My question is, if you assess rental value, can you collect rental data? And we collect deed transfer data because your deed transfer is not legally, your deed transfer doesn't have legal standing if you haven't registered it in a timely fashion. And I was thinking that a lease that is not registered by the landlord would still bind the landlord, but it would not bind the tenant. So if you had a law that said a landlord must register his lease, then you get all that assessment data on rentals. And the landlord would do that because otherwise he gets no no protection from the tenant, but the tenant still gets full protection from him.
Yeah, I think in Connecticut, for example, we annually would collect from all the commercial properties income and expense statements, and everyone complied. We got them from everybody, all the commercial properties. So we were able to actually give in great detail the amount of rent and the net rent and the cap and you know, basically come up with an income approach. Now, in terms of residential properties, this is not going to happen overnight. Changing from market value to rental value will take years, you know, many years. So I think that we have plenty of time to see how things will change. But I think in a period of time, there will be where people with houses, in terms of real estate values, you know, are going to want to see that the information is available and collected, and that time will fix that problem.
Great. Peter Frank.
Yes, land rent has always confused me. Could you give just a brief and a working definition of rental value as opposed to market value? I understand market value, but rental value has always been hard for me.
Okay, rental value is equal to the market value times the capitalization rate. That's what so if you know what the market value is and the capitalization rate, you'll know what the rental value is. We'll go over in detail that in lesson 3 and lesson 4. And where we'll be figuring out, we'll actually be calculating land rents and how it's done. You know, I can understand why it's difficult to conceive, but in terms of math and in terms of doing it, it's quite simple.
Right. Okay, thanks.
I would just note that the the variation is that the selling price is based on projected rents over the next over the next 20 or so years. So the current rent, if a neighborhood is declining, the current rent is expected to fall relative to general real estate. But if the neighborhood is gentrifying, then the current rent is expected to rise. So the gentrifying place will have a higher value than looking at today's rent would predict.
Okay, good point.
Thank you, Dan. I think Tom has another question.
Does everyone with their hand up still have questions, or?
Yes, I do actually. Thank you. I'm sorry. Yeah.
That would be the last one because it's 8:03. Go ahead, Tom.
Okay, so the question is, do you have a view on taxing the land in an existing city and the land value return, or having if we could have a new city with the community owning the land? Would that be a more optimal way to achieve Henry George's vision?
Yes, of course. That would be ideal. And that, you know, it has come up a couple of times as possibilities, but I haven't really seen, other than in Cambria, Australia, where the city owned all the land and leases it out. There's one primary example of what you just suggested. And that's, you know, that's one way of doing it. That would be an ideal way of doing it.
And you said that was that Canberra in Australia?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
So that's it for tonight, and we will meet again for this very class on Monday again, 6:30. And we still have another course going on with Alana. That's on Wednesday, 6:30. So looking forward to seeing you all. Thank you all for coming.